waiting just a few minutes until most of the participants have come in. So we'll just take a couple minutes more. I'm receiving some very nice messages from colleagues around the country. So thank you for your patience. Well, given that we only have an hour for our event today, I think we should get started. Thank you for joining us today for today's IPAC webinar, 30 years later, what have we learned about public sector innovation? Today, we celebrate the winner of the J.E.H Hodgetts Award for the best English article in the 2020 issue of Canadian Public Administration, the Journal of the Institute of Public Administration of Canada. My name is Everett Lindquist, and I serve as editor of the journal and as Professor of Public Administration at the University of Victoria. Today, I'm hosting this event from the traditional territories of the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples, whose historical relationships with that land continue to this day. The J.E.H Hodgetts Award was created in 1992 by the Institute of Public Administration of Canada to honor the contributions of Ted Hodgetts, who passed away in 2009. Professor Hodgetts received the Order of Canada in 1989 in honor of a lifetime of achievement and public service. He was also awarded IPAC's Vanier Gold Medal in 1981 in recognition of his exceptional leadership and significant contribution to the field of public administration. This year, the Hodgetts Award Committee was comprised of Patrice Dutil from Ryerson, Geneviève Tellier from Ottawa, University of Ottawa, and Caitlin Brownrigg, President of IPAC Victoria and Director in the Technology and Business Transformation Branch, BC Ministry of Advanced Education and Skills Training. The committee members independently reviewed all of the English articles in the 2020 volume of Canadian Public Administration and then compared their respective rankings. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the jury for their really good work. The committee selected this article entitled Experimenting with Public Sector Innovation, Revisiting GOW for the Digital Era. The jury observed, and I quote, Carey Doberstein and Étienne Charbonneau combined their distinctive talents to update Ian Gow's 1994 model of how innovations are transmitted by public servants within governments, as well as between them. Now, for those of you who don't know, Ian Gow co-authored a highly regarded monograph entitled Learning from Others, Administrative Innovations Among Canadian Governments, which reviewed and analyzed 15 cases of innovation and diffusion in Canada. The jury went on to note, using modern surveying techniques, they approached the IPAC membership and replayed Gow's questions to a new generation. But the authors did not stop there. They also created split ballot experimental vignettes and asked their respondents for their views on how they would react. The findings of this dual method article are compellingly analyzed and provocative. They go on to say, this article makes a signal contribution to research in Canada, both in terms of methodology and in its conclusions. It should be widely read by scholars, students, and public servants themselves. Now, I have not mentioned the content that was in the jury's commendation because I will soon be turning it over to Carey and Étienne. But let me tell you just a bit about each of our guests. Carey Doberstein is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of British Columbia, and he also happens to be Associate Editor of the journal Canadian Public Administration. Among his many other articles, he has also authored 2 important books, Building a Collaborative Advantage, Network Governance, Homelessness Policymaking in Canada, and Distributed Democracy, Healthcare Governance in Ontario. Étienne Charbonneau holds the Canada Research Chair in Comparative Public Management at École Nationale d'Administration Publique, otherwise known as ENAP. He has published an impressive number of articles on diverse topics. Recent examples include a qualitative study of pandemic-induced telework, Federal Workers Thrive, Working Parents Struggle. And he has a co-authored monograph on calibrating public accountability, the fragile relationship between police departments and civilians in an age of video surveillance. Carey and Étienne have also collaborated on another article measuring the acceptability of facial recognition-enabled work surveillance cameras in the public and private sector in public performance and management review. So welcome, Carey and Étienne, and now I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
So thank you very much for this opportunity to share with you a paper that was published not quite a year ago. C'est pour un prix anglophone. Donc, la présentation va se dérouler en anglais. Par contre, bien sûr, si vous avez des questions en français, ça va nous faire plaisir de les prendre à la toute fin. So, Canadian Public Administration has a rich history, and one book that both Carey and I really like was published more than 30 years ago. It was a very comprehensive study with different parts, different kind of methods to really document how administrative innovations were going on in Canada, and we wanted to put a modern spin on it. So, Carey?
Sure, thanks. So, yeah, as we're going to sort of alternate as we go through the presentation. So, as Étienne said, James Gow published Learning from Others in the early 1990s, and it was really a survey of IPAC members in Canada to learn how they learn from each other and other jurisdictions and what really drives innovation in the public sector. And so now we're about 30 years out from Gow's study. And so we were interested if the sources and processes of innovation have really changed in the public sector in Canada. So obviously certain things have changed in the last 30 years in the bureaucracy in the world. I mean, the policy advisory system has evolved, the production of academic research and how it's related to public servants has changed. And of course, the digital revolution that may allow for learning, you know, among other things, learning from more distant innovations around the world with relative ease. So we wanted to go back into the field and replicate, as Everett said, key parts of the Gow survey, but also add this experimental dimension that doesn't just rely on us asking public servants, you know, what's important about an innovation. But what the experimental method can do is get public servants to reveal what's important about innovations in terms of how they view it, the appropriateness of it, and its promise. And we do that through experimental vignettes or basically descriptions of real innovations around the world. And then we asked our public servant sample in Canada to rate how promising those innovations are and how much adaptation would be required to implement in their jurisdiction.
So just as Gow did, we surveyed IPAC members. In our case, non-academic IPAC members. We didn't want academic researchers or professors in the sample. The response rate we got was lower than Gow's, but somewhat in the ballpark of other studies that relied on IPAC members. And by the way, if you answered our survey and you're here today, thank you very much. However, we, especially for the second part of our paper, we perform power analyses. So what this is to power analysis enables you to parse out eventually if we don't have statistically significant results, is it because there's no correlation or because your sample size is too small to pick it up? So we did them, realized we didn't have quite enough people as we wanted. So we use a fledgling version at the time of the Canadian Public Service Research Panel, which you should definitely sign up to if you haven't already. And we surveyed these members, also the same survey to get the sample size where it needed to be. Eventually, we got to 719 effective, like full, mostly full surveys. Doesn't mean everyone answered every single question, but this is the sample size we have. About half of them are federal public servants. About half of them provincial. We don't have as many municipal public servants as we should have. Although all the provinces and territories are represented, sadly, we don't have quite enough people from Quebec, and we don't have quite enough francophone to really represent all public servants. But we do have a variety of public servants from coast to coast. So yes, Carey.
Yeah, so I mean, we can get right to comparing the survey results with Gao's, and then we'll introduce our own contribution, I guess you could say. So right here, you can see in this table, a comparative table of Gao's data with our data on a key question he asked public servants, which was to select the top 3 sources of innovative ideas in the public sector. And you can see on that list various sources. He asked them to rank the choices, like this is the first most important one, second and third, and so did we. And we present in this table, you know, the frequency with which someone selected the first choice and then how much that appeared in the top 3. So 2 measures to basically get a sense of how important these sources are for public servants. And so I've highlighted in green and red, and I'm realizing colorblind, that's not very generous to colorblind folks. But those that are in green are the ones that have increased over time, increased in importance over time, according to our sample, and red are those that have decreased based on our replication data. And what we see are some interesting findings. One is a marked decline in senior public servants as being key sources of innovative ideas in the public sector. In addition, commissions of inquiry appear to have dropped precipitously, and cabinet ministers as key innovators as well. What we do see is in green, possibly a shift towards think tanks, innovation labs, and behavioral insights teams. And I say possibly because Gao didn't ask about a couple of these because they didn't really exist in his time. But so you sort of see what's going up, what's going down in our sample relative to Gao's here. On the next slide, we see what are the top 3 jurisdictions to watch to demonstrate the feasibility of innovations? And why do we ask this question? Well, Gao asked this question, but there's also a whole literature about the diffusion of innovation on a geographical basis. And so we wanted to inquire about that. And what we see is that Canadian jurisdictions, in particular the provinces, remain important areas to watch from our public servant sample in terms of demonstrating the feasibility of innovations. But we do see a decline in US jurisdictions as important comparators. Might have been the time at which we surveyed this in the middle of the Trump era, or just sort of generally reflecting the sclerotic nature of American policymaking in recent years. But we do see more emphasis in Scandinavian contexts. That's also inferred because Gao didn't ask about that, but he also did ask about UK and Europe, and we did too, didn't report it here due to space, but it's about in between US and Scandinavian countries in terms of top jurisdictions. We do have some additional comparative data, by the way, from Gao around what are the central means of reflection that guide people's thinking. We're not reporting it here. Some of it has implications for digital era governance, so we can talk about it if there's interest in towards the end. But we've got to get to the experimental component.
Yes. So on this one, so it's a split ballot experimental vignette. What this means is we have a short description of a technology and innovation. And it was not known if you participated in the survey, but as you logged in to fill out the survey, you were assigned to a slightly different version. So we gave the same choices of answers to everyone, but we asked the question slightly differently to whoever was logging in. And the important part here is that it was randomized, and the randomization is going to do the heavy lifting for very simple comparison that are coming up in the other part of an analysis. And because these questions are asked a little bit differently, and that's the only difference, at the end, if we see a difference in the pattern of responses by respondents, we know that these differences are because of the different ways we ask the question. So Carey, about these four innovations that we tested.
Yeah, so we basically mine the literature and sort of public sector magazines to identify a number of innovations. And these are generally small, sort of administrative style innovations, which is really what Gao focused on as well. From the real world though, and for each of them, we selected a dimension of innovation feasibility that we wanted to test with the different vignettes. So, so you see four different innovations that we've sort of mined and used in the survey there. One was microtasking, which is basically sort of crowdsourcing government tasks. In this case, we provided that it was to digitize content for a national library. Okay, so crowdsourcing involves interested members of the public to contribute towards a public task. Okay, this is used in the real world. And like the other innovations, we don't really care so much about the actual innovation and what people think of it, but we do care about the dimension of innovation we are testing associated with it. So in this case, we are testing the location, where the source of the innovation sort of first started, okay, which we randomly vary that across respondents, okay? And I think Étienne will talk about precisely, the geographical terms when he gets to that. A second innovation we talked about, we presented was social impact bonds. And for those who don't know, this is also known as pay for success financing in sort of welfare provision. So basically private investors provide upfront funding to a program, and the government really only pays if the intervention is successful. We see a lot of social impact bonds in the UK, for example. And the third innovation was dynamic pricing for parking in San Francisco. And this is a really interesting innovation that we discovered, which is basically parking lots use sensor technology via an app to provide information on what vacant spaces exist, where they are in particular in the lots, and allows parking managers to adjust pricing according to demand. And this was solving a problem in San Francisco of people sort of creating congestion by circling areas that really had no fruitful opportunities for parking. The fourth innovation, very quickly, is around incentive prizes. Many of you will have heard of this, which is basically a prize-based challenge for organizations to solve a particular problem and offer a reward to the winner. We see this a lot in sort of tech-focused innovation, but we also see it within government. So as I said, we're sort of interested whether people find social impact bonds interesting or dynamic pricing interesting. But what we are really interested in from a scholarly perspective is the dimension of innovation that we randomly manipulated here, okay? So, so we have basically a vignette of text in the survey describing what microtasking is, for example, as an administrative innovation. Randomly insert a descriptive variable we care about. In this case, it's the location of who pioneered this. It was either Finland, Oregon, Quebec, or the home province of the respondent that we sort of fed into the question. And then we asked them how promising they think this innovation is, okay? And how much adaptation is required. And like Étienne said, the analysis, is pretty simple because it's just a mean score comparison, because the only thing we say in the vignettes is one word.
That's the beauty of randomization, is after that, you don't have to be good at stats. You just need to do really, really simple means of comparison, and it gives you your answer. So here, whoever, like the public servants, the IPAC members or CPSR panel members that fill it out. So randomized, like a quarter of them were told that this microtasking innovation came from Finland. Another quarter, which is a progressive Scandinavian country, another one from a progressive American state, another one from a progressive Canadian province. And the fourth one, which is of particular interest to us, since we asked them in the beginning where they were from, we were able, and by we I say Carey, to program in having the name of their own province coming in. And this was especially interesting for us, since about like half of the sample are provincial public servants. And we would think maybe about the promise of the innovation, but especially about adaptation. If it's your own province, you would think you would need less, and that is not what we get at all. We don't get here, like these small differences here are not statistically significant. So it didn't really matter where this came from about microtasking. Pretty much everyone find them on average by group as promising and as needing this roughly the same amount of adaptation to each other. So this is one of them. About the social impact bonds. So here, for about a third against randomized, we didn't mention price at all. We just presented what are social impact bonds and how you think this is something promising, and how much adaptation would you need to import it in your own organization, which was one of the questions that was really important for Gao, saying a lot of people are not adapters, they're adopters, they're adapters. So this is what we wanted to know. And here, just mentioning a prize makes the answers different. And interestingly, we would have think, well, maybe like if something wins earns a prize, maybe it's going to be seem more like less attainable. But here, weirdly, if it's nominated for a prize rather than earning a prize, then it's seen as even less promising and needing more adaptation. So we don't know if it's something about how alien it is to people, like if it's and maybe this is why they don't see it as something they can really apply to their own context. But here, just mentioning prizes did not necessarily help in trying to sell an innovation, which is not what we would expect. The third one, because we're not presenting all four, is about politics. So here, dynamic pricing, we mentioned mostly at the municipal level. For a quarter of respondents, we just again present dynamic pricing, but for the other quarters, either we say, well, it's been debated in a kind of a mixed way, and we would think it would have been roughly equal. It wasn't. Usually it was seen as less promising and needing more adaptation. But even if we reported that it's been debated positively, it still seemed like it needed more adaptation than nothing at all. So just mentioning there's politics and maybe backlash or discussions, or like maybe elected officials will get involved, it made public servants more weary and thinking it's a little less promising. And obviously, we're in the public sector, the negativity bias is high. If we mentioned that it's been debated negatively, then it really dropped seriously. It's one of the biggest differences we found in this part of the paper.
Great, yeah, so a little bit more data before we wrap up. After the presentation of each of the 4 policy innovations, we also asked all respondents to rank from 5 options, basically what would be the most important next step to implement this policy innovation, assuming you wanted to, right? And what we have summarized in this table are the 3 most popular choices for each summarized here. So basically, we're seeing across different exposures to different policy innovations, what are the patterns in what our public servant sample think are the most important things to sort of think about as one is sort of to move forward in thinking further or pursuing a policy innovation. And what we can see is that most commonly cited by our respondents was in blue here, to obtain more specific evidence of success in a similar context. That's what public servants in our sample wanted to see next, if they were to treat this with more seriousness. It's in the top 3 of all 4 issue areas. And this really connects to the research utilization literature, which has similarly discovered a strong appetite among policy professionals for very specific and quote unquote hard evidence to inform their work, and connects with that rational analysis dimension that Gao talked about in 1994. The next most common sort of important step that emerges from our data in green appears to be that public servants want information that addresses political risks and considerations. Again, it appears in the top 3 of all 4 issue areas, and likewise connects with the third piece articulated by Gao in his 94 book regarding the political pressures as sort of critical for policy professionals as they contemplate and adapt policy innovations. You'll see that the actual top ranked for the 2 actually split, but they are, to us, related directly to the nature of those innovations. So when we're talking about social impact bonds and dynamic pricing, those are sort of price mechanisms. And so it's natural to assume that public servants would want sort of more precise cost estimates. Likewise, the administrative innovations of microtasking and incentive prices, those are sort of very different ways of doing public administration. And so you'd imagine there's potentially bureaucratic resistance to them. But overall, what we see is sort of patterns across the 4 different types of innovations within our public servant sample. The very last sort of slide, just to wrap up, is certain things are going down in our sample and certain things are going up, as we talked about. It seems senior public servants, according to our sample, are less cited as key sources of innovation, and think tanks, behavioral insights team, policy innovation labs are more important. Our experimental results are kind of interesting in that we in essence laid traps for our respondents to fall in terms of, seeing if in this exercise, they took shortcuts to looking what a promising innovation is, where it originated, that sort of Scandinavian allure, or whether it received a public sector award. And ultimately, public servants didn't really fall for it. If you think about, that's sort of in essence what we were doing here. We're seeing if they use heuristics to sort of translate and make shortcuts in terms of shaping how they feel about something. So the final word is just, in our view, this study, I think, paints a portrait of our Canadian public servant sample as fundamentally open to innovations from around the world, but I'd say perhaps skeptical of trends or shortcuts as markers of their feasibility in a Canadian context. So to me, it's a group that operates with sort of, an openness, a curiosity, but a critical lens on public sector innovations from around the world. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Carey and Étienne, for that succinct presentation. It's really interesting, puts a lot of things on the table. Before I turn to our two commentators, I just want to say to the rest of the audience out there, if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then I will scan them and select a few to fold into our discussion. So now we turn to our two commentators. Let me introduce them very briefly to you. First is Amanda Clarke. She is Associate Professor, School of Public Policy Administration at Carleton University. She's published widely, but is well known for her book, Opening the Government of Canada, the Federal Bureaucracy in the Digital Age. And she's a Digital Government Research Fellow of the Canada School of Public Service. Patrice Dutil is Professor of Politics and Public Administration at Ryerson University, soon to be renamed, and author of many books on Canadian public administration and Canadian history, along with many articles and book chapters. He served as IPAC's Director of Research and previously won the Hodgetts Award. Among his many eclectic array of articles are Crowdsourcing as a New Instrument in the Government's Arsenal, Explorations and Considerations. So thank you for joining us today, Amanda and Patrice. We'll start with you, Amanda. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And I'll begin by, of course, congratulating Carey and Étienne on what I think is a really excellent paper and definitely very deserving of this award, and definitely should be on the reading lists of all public policy courses in Canada and in the inboxes of busy executives who I'm sure would love another email, but definitely need to be reading a little bit more about the behavioral, the habits that they have when it comes to interpreting innovation. And so in my brief comments today, I wanted to highlight three things that I think this paper teaches us and that should give us kind of directions for policy action and for public management going forward, especially in the context that undeniably, still amidst the pandemic and moving forward in needing to innovate our way out of what are some pretty existential, social, environmental, economic crises. So this paper is timely, clearly, and it has a lot to teach us. So the first thing that I'll say is that I found it so fascinating to see in the paper the sources of innovation that are prioritized as promising by the respondents versus where power to actually implement innovation lies in the public service. So my own research constantly finds that public servants need their senior officials to be on board to do anything new and different for a whole range of reasons: risk aversion, status quo biases, the need to kind of work the system and implement change. Yet this paper finds that senior officials are rarely the source, are not as regularly now seen as sources of innovation. So I think that's supported in what we see in some of the qualitative research, but also really helps hit home that we have to evaluate how we're incentivizing our senior officials in the public service in Canada. And this has been a long documented issue within Canadian public administration, and probably the time now is more ripe than ever to really evaluate why our senior officials aren't playing this role, because they have the levers to affect the change. Whereas behavioral insight teams and innovation labs, which were prioritized as sources of innovation in the study or in the responses, rarely have those levers. And they're often, I think Everett might call them sort of adhocracies is a term that he likes, which I think works well. They're often at the margins. Many public servants don't even know they exist. They can be seen as sort of upstart groups. So they might be seen as sources of innovation, but they don't have the power to affect change. And that's a real kind of issue. The second thing is that I think the study's findings around the importance of sort of the political risk obsession, if you will, of public servants, that this is such a prominent concern. And again, this is very, very well documented in the Canadian public administration literature. And I would say that my comparative work also suggests that this is a particularly acute problem in Canada, perhaps because we have, at least from the perspective of many public servants, a sense that we have a very combative political culture and that there's very little tolerance for failure. And the fear of kind of putting your minister on the front page of the Globe and Mail, the kind of, I think, Donald Savoy has well covered this idea of like the Canadian government's living in an error-free having the sense that there's only scope for error-free government and that we have a cover your ass culture. All of these things are sort of anathema to innovation, which require a mindset that embraces the potential for failure, for experimentation. And so that concerns about the sort of the political blowback from an innovation, if it failed perhaps, is again really telling. And I think what's great about this paper is it brings forth new data to really kind of illustrate what we already kind of know, but provided in a very like plain sense. And so the implication is, I think, not just sort of internal to the public service, but I think we as kind of members of a political society, here I'm thinking of elected officials, I'm thinking of pundits, and I'm thinking of journalists, need to really evaluate whether or not what is lost in terms of generating public value and building a capable public service that innovates if we continue to focus so much on small errors in government, blow out of proportion failures, as opposed to sort of rewarding experimentation and innovation. We don't read many stories about that in the papers, and that is a problem. And then the third point that I would make is that the findings around public servants' desire for more specific evidence of the sort of the outcomes of innovations and on their success, which I think Carey's point at the end, that this suggests we have a very, that's a very good thing about our public service, that, because we should want evidence-based policymaking. On the other hand, maybe an implication is that, we also know governments are not particularly good at collecting that sort of evidence. And this is what the results and delivery movement was supposed to be about, was, really focusing on kind of hard data to look at outcomes. And so there's a lot of room for us as educators of future public servants as well to evaluate, for those of us who are teaching in schools of public policy, for example, to what extent are we equipping our students to be really strong evaluators, to collect compelling data, to tell the whole picture of how a policy manifested in practice and what impact it had on target populations, et cetera. And then the other part of it as well is sort of training and encouraging public servants to really work in the open and to talk about the innovations with which they're experimenting, to talk about the results of their initiatives. And again, we don't necessarily see a lot of that except in certain pockets. So the open policymaking movement could be a really important stream of kind of focus going forward if we want to encourage more innovation in our public services. So those are, I think, the 3 points that I took from revisiting the paper, which I loved when I first read it years ago with the Canadian Political Science Association, and which I still am constantly talking about now and citing and encouraging my students and other public servants I meet to read. So congratulations to you both, and thank you very much for presenting your paper again to us today.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for those comments. Now over to Patrice.
Well, hello from Toronto, and I want to add my congratulations again to Carey and Étienne for a great piece of work. I was the third wheel on the jury, as Everett pointed out, and wholeheartedly supported this this nomination for the award. I have a bunch of of comments that will lead to questions and maybe trigger some reflections among the people who are listening to us. Among the various findings, some are surprising, some aren't. It depends on where you come from, of course, and if you talk to different people, you recognize that there's a range of opinions about innovation in government. A lot of people, and I'll include people like Donald Savoy here, no slouch in the field, who think that government innovation, in the words of Mahatma Gandhi, is a good idea. Does it really happen? How come it doesn't happen more often? Show me innovation, and I'll appreciate it. A lot of people, of course, are convinced that innovation happens all the time. And I think the older you are, the more you realize that things are very different now than what they used to be. So there's no doubt that innovation, that the spirit of innovation has changed over the last 30 years. Now, this study is important because it's important to capture the change from Ian Gow's 1994 study. Ian Gow studied innovation at the dawn of a new era. There was no internet. He would have done his questionnaire with a paper and envelopes. It was a completely different period. It was a time when senior public servants were still subject experts in their field. That era is over. Senior public servants, by and large, there are exceptions, are not experts in their field. For me, it was a confirmation of that trend towards managerialism that's been captured in a variety of different fields, different approaches. But what's important about this study is that it looks at the environment in which public sector innovation takes place. As opposed to most studies, and I'm among those, who've looked at innovation in a more positivistic way. In other words, show me the innovation and let me evaluate the degree to which it is an innovation. Let me see how this innovation took place. I've done a couple of studies in that regard, most recently with my colleague, Andrea Migoni, when we were looking at procurement in the government of Ontario, and we asked people inside government who told us that, well, we are massively innovative. And then we asked their counterparts in the private sector who said, government innovation, are you serious? We're still waiting. What Doberstein and Étienne Charbonneau tell us is that there is an environment inside the public service that makes a decision as to what will work and what will not work. And their findings are fascinating. Fascinating in the sense that they are confirmed, but also fascinating in what they reveal. So for example, Scandinavia is seen as a place of innovation. The United States is not seen as a place of innovation. Cabinet ministers are not seen as a locus of innovation. And yet, the number one consideration among public servants is, well, will this fly with the political operatives? Will it fly with the premier's office or with the prime minister's office? So the innovators are not political, but the politicals can be brakes, at least in the minds of civil servants, of innovation. There's a number of other things that I find to be particularly fascinating, but I'm led to a question. We need more innovation. We need constant innovation. And in the post-COVID environment, we're going to see, I suspect, and I'm curious to see what others think about this. We're going to see a demand for a different kind of innovation. We're going to be seeing innovations that are going to be aimed at cost cutting, at massively increasing efficiencies. Where is that going to lead us in terms of the environment in the public service for innovation? Last but not least, and I want to leave it with this because it's contrary to everything I teach. I keep saying that pilot studies matter. And you know, and I've heard the accusation that Canada is the #1 country for pilot studies. Pilot studies in our country go to die. I mean, we do pilot studies and then we abandon pilot studies. And yet the findings of Doberstein and Charbonneau is that pilot studies don't really matter. Did I get this wrong, gentlemen? Did I get this wrong? And how can there be a future without pilot studies? So I'll leave it at that. Where does a future environment going to lead us in terms of innovation in the post-COVID period? And are we really going to say goodbye to pilot studies? I'll leave it at that.
Great. Well, thank you for that, Patrice. You're never less than provocative, that's for sure. And thank you too, Amanda, for your comments. So I'm wondering if Carey and Étienne could just briefly respond to those points, because I'd like to take a few questions from the audience, and I've got a list here. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I can very quickly respond to that last provocative point by Patrice. And Étienne can maybe select from other comments he'd like to respond to. Should we abandon pilot studies? I don't think anyone should do anything on the basis of this single study. In part because, first of all, this is a perceptual based study, right? We are asking people's perceptions of things, not, we didn't give them, details about the particular outcomes of the pilot study. This is a great question, by the way, but it is shaped by, it's maybe confusing for the audience because it's one we didn't talk about in the presentation today, but it also had basically no findings. Whether we talked about a pilot study for, was conducted in certain jurisdictions where the opioid crisis was high or not, was not considered more or less valid as sort of evidence about whether or not it should be pursued. And so, yeah, I mean, the detail in the vignette in this case was not particularly substantive. It's perceptual based study. It's 700 public servants, many of them not from Quebec. So like a certain part of the country is, if I think this, this article has value, which I do, I think it is to inspire additional research, to check the sort of robustness in different kind of formulations. I know from my own work in homelessness that housing first pilot studies were directly consequential to the rollout of that program at a nationwide scale. So, so in this case, I'm sort of, I see clear evidence to the contrary of my findings in this study, in other studies. So a lot more work needs to be done. And I know you were sort of being a little bit facetious on it, but don't abandon anything you're doing yet on this one study.
Étienne?
Yes, so on pilot studies, there's also what I mentioned we didn't cover is that, like, on my own research on police body cams, pilot studies tell you it costs a lot, it doesn't do a lot in Canada, but then there's political pressure and something bad happens and you're a political official, you have to do something. Signing a check and buying equipment can do it. So I understand there are political, realities beyond this. But yes, as Carey mentioned, there's a limit we didn't do, as Luc Bernier and others did, looking at real prizes and tracking them down and seeing which one happened and where, and how come in central agencies doesn't happen as much as other places. People that have the answers, like central agencies, don't necessarily try different things at the same time and see which one works better on average. Okay, doesn't mean it never happens, but like, and to Amanda's point, there's also like this consideration of where you are in the public service, how much leeway you have, and do you have enough autonomy to set something up and set yourself for possible failure? Do you have that permission to do it or not? And it's not always the case that unlike if we have like specific groups dedicated to it, saying, okay, we hear like 3 things we could possibly do, and let's randomize our intervention or teams, and let's see eventually what happens, what's better. But again, for that, also you need to know, you need to track down the results of what you're doing, which is not a given in government. Like sometimes, as in Quebec, we need a law to make sure that ministries do it, because otherwise, not all of them would do it. So there's a lot of things going on there.
Thank you, Étienne. So there's a number of questions here. I'm going to go to some of the larger ones. There's a couple technical questions that have been posed, but first of all, there's one from Michael Fenn. The term think tank can embrace organizations that have an advocacy agenda rather than simply being a neutral policy research entity. Does the emergence of think tanks as a more significant source of new ideas have implications for lobbying and government relations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And in fact, I have a study from a few years ago, almost about this very question, in which I also did an experiment with a survey with public servants in a handful of provinces and basically presented research to them from academics, think tanks, and also that sort of fuzzy advocacy research kind of group that like presents themselves as a research body. An example would be the Canadian Federation for Independent Business. They are obviously an interest group, an advocacy group, but they also sort of produce research findings that present to the public. And similar to what Étienne and I did here, I just basically changed the labels on these research summaries from academic research, think tank research, and advocacy research. And what I found was anything labeled as sort of from an advocacy group, even if it really wasn't the same source content, public servants in Canada highly discounted that information. Very, very much skeptical of interest-based advocacy-oriented research. And that is true as well with the most ideologically pure, I guess you could say, or obvious of the think tanks out there. We're sort of treated more like advocacy groups. And the more sort of, the more a think tank would sort of orient itself to traditional academic norms, the more credibility I discovered in that study. If you're interested in that study, it's called Whom Do Bureaucrats Believe? I don't know.
Great, thank you very much. Stuart Goodings has a question. Do you have any data on how different levels of public servants view the feasibility of innovation, i.e. EX1s compared to lower level managers or say assistant deputy ministers?
Short answer, no. We didn't do it. We have the data, but I think it would have been especially interesting in the first kind of like descriptive questions, looking over the same questions as Gao. However, for the experimental part, the idea is that these different kind of public servants would be randomized equally in each group. What we didn't, so it wouldn't matter there for the overall results, but no, we had the information and we didn't splice it up by where they are to see if there's pattern there. And part of it is that depending of the question, since we had sometimes 4 groups, and we wanted to see differences for at least like a point out of 10 or like 10%, it would have been hard sometimes to have enough statistical power to parse them out to know if there's a difference or not. So we had the data, we didn't do it, but we could have looked into that. But overall for the results, like it shouldn't make a difference there, but maybe there's different dynamics at that level that are driving part of the results, but we haven't looked at them.
Great, thank you. Now I've got a question here from Luc Bernier, but also I'm going to fold something into this as well. He asks, a part of the research by Gao on innovation was about the possibility to replicate about and diffuse. Is it possible to replicate what comes from Scandinavia? And I guess what I would like to add further to your presentation comments about the need for more transparency and dialogue about innovations, particularly pilot innovations in progress, importing from other jurisdictions, is would not one role or function of more public discussions of that kind of work benefit from the contextual analysis of a lot of comparative policy, public management, and political science scholars to kind of understand the structures and culture that, and even inside bureaucracies that that produce those innovations. So I'm wondering if you had some responses to Luc and my question.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I'm curious if Amanda and Patrice also have thoughts. They're sort of certainly Amanda's in this field more than Étienne and I sort of dance around. But what really strikes me is that when we think about policy design in some ways, depending on how it's done, it is sort of divorced from its political context or institutional context, as if it's sort of a toolkit one can use to innovate and design and adapt the policy without the sort of necessary political analysis associated with what cultural norms exist for the delivery and instruments used in a particular jurisdiction. And that's why I think GAO and us, we were attentive to political considerations. I mean, only so much as you can in a experimental survey instrument that is really designed to narrow in on particular dimensions. I think which in some ways exposes the limitations of experiments. I mean, Étienne and I do a number of them, but we're not evangelists with this method. I think in some ways it's helpful to isolate and quantify certain dimensions, but something like innovation fundamentally is about the synergy of competing factors and how various institutional, sort of individual behavior and sort of broader culture within a public service can bear upon an outcome. And it's not, the method we use is not one particularly suited to get at that, or at least the sort of credible answer on that.
Thank you, Carey. Now, I've got a couple questions here that I'm going to blend, if I can, to put a larger sort of question on the table. So I have one from Jean-Francois Levesque, who sort of has three questions. What do you mean by feasibility, capacity, and resources or openness? Do you question the capacity of civil servants to innovate and their skills? In the presentation, it seems to me that the relationship, and this is the most important to me, to innovation is the implementation of an external innovation in an organization. Is that correct? If so, what do we mean by innovation? Is it only technological innovation? So here we get to the digital era. Could innovation be an internal change or transformation in the delivery of a service or program? And then there's a comment in the chat room by Sandra Borns. Hello, Sandy, who's written a lot in this area from a narrative perspective. This is a comment. My research found that innovations that provide evidence of their impact that are written up in the media and that are more replicated are more likely to win awards than those that don't. So this reverses the causality of the author's view of the impact of winning awards on replication. Now, and that derives from Sandy's well-known research on using innovation award as data for thinking about innovation. What I want to leaven these observations with is what I found one of the really nice contributions of your piece is you provide an update on the literature on public sector innovation. And I think the previous questions along with these two sort of get at the different kinds of variables that one might look at, different ways into the innovation process. And so I'm just wondering here with this bundle of questions, if you've seen market change in how the innovation literature thinks about innovation, especially with respect to this idea of digital innovation that's sort of changing what's going on inside government, in terms of systems as opposed to sort of like policy shifts, new programs. I know that's a big bundle there, but I thought we could end with a big, a big set of questions. And then Carey and Étienne, you can take a crack at that, and then I'll also go to Amanda and Patrice to close things off. Okay.
Yeah, that's there's a lot there. We didn't want to bore too many people. There's many definitions of innovations in the paper, and we present some of them, including some of them are perceptual, some of them it's an idea of practice or object it's perceived as new by an individual, another unique in adoption. So this is one of the ones we use. From Barnes, there were like 3 different parts of it. So we tried to cover the 3 different parts, including the third part, the context. In there, like getting to Luc's question, can you import? I would say with the taxes I paid in Quebec, you can absolutely import the kind of public service that Scandinavia pays for. I think it's a fair comparison, at least from the input side. So it is, I mean, from Sandy's question there, like it is interesting, that part. I haven't thought about this, like why, speculating a bit more, and I think that's an interesting explanation of why being nominated would be received differently from being awarded an award, since we know there's not a big difference necessarily between these kind of projects, at least when they're nominated. So this part I haven't thought of. I don't know if Carey did. But generally, like from what is being said, like with all these different ways to get to innovation, I was very surprised of like how the private sector is not seen as being innovative, since, as Patrice said, there's a lot that happens there because they can take risks. If Uber goes out of business, there's other companies to come in. But if the city of Lethbridge goes broke, then it's a real catastrophe. We can't do anything. There is for sure a reason why in public sector there are some constraints of taking risk and maybe failing, and some of them make sense. Like I'm okay with some innovations personally being developed elsewhere and then carefully being adopted once someone else kind of like gave a proof of concept. Although I would like to see a government being the first and trying to see if in a public context, in a politicized context, it can be done or not. So I don't know if Carey wants to add to this bundle of joy of questions.
Just very quickly, because I do want to hear from Amanda and Patrice as our resident experts. So yeah, I think on sort of the digital space, my initial thoughts are, I mean, I think we see a lot of innovation on sort of administrative and internal processes. I think when I look at the literature, I don't see a ton of, capital P policy innovation. What we do see in the new era is a lot of administrative innovations. Sort of as Patrice was hinting at about what's coming even more in the future is about streamlining internal processes that sort of the digital revolution can enhance, save money, etc. And that may come with pros and cons. The one thing I just wanted to quickly mention that I hinted at the beginning is the digital revolution, I think, changes the way public servants reflect upon how problems are solved, how they get information. And what we saw in the data, which we didn't present here, is this market change in webinars, for example, as a place for source of information, professional networks that are enabled by sort of the digital era that I think is going to change the way information flows within and across governments. But for the real answer, we go to Amanda Clarke.
I was thinking deeply about what you were saying. I mean, I think, well, okay, I would say that on the digital piece, what's interesting about the digital revolution in government in particular is that actually a lot of the things that are being advocated for in the digital government orthodoxy would by many not be considered innovative, and they don't even really have to do with technology. They're more about engaging with users of services. So in there, they borrow from ideas from the co-production, like long-standing literature, and work on sort of participatory, community-oriented policymaking, or things like iteration and learning. So having tight feedback loops between implementation and delivery, from implementation and policy design. Again, really, we've been talking about that for a long time in the policy studies literature. So I think the term innovation can be kind of distracting sometimes. What I think this paper helps us do better, will help us do better when it comes to thinking about how to modernize our public services for the digital age and for the kind of contemporary reality in which we live, is that, this really isn't a paper about why innovation happens or not. It is a study about public servants as gatekeepers to change. What heuristics, what pieces of information convince a public servant that they should try to do something different. And that something different could be very small. It doesn't need to be adopting AI or blockchain or whatever other big sort of transformation or fancy technology we could talk about. And so that's where the paper is super helpful, because we know that when it comes to modernizing the public service, which we've been trying to do for decades in Canada, far before we ever had email addresses or thought about Zoom, is that, you know, we constantly find that it's the senior leaders who are sclerotic and afraid of change that are really kind of limiting that opportunity to modernize. So this paper helps us understand what we have to do to convince those leaders, how we have to speak to them, how we have to present new ways of working to get them on board. And that's really valuable, frankly, especially in this moment.
Great, thank you. And actually, Sandy's comment speaks directly to that last point. It's very interesting. Patrice, the last word to you.
Well, maybe not the last word, I hope not, but simply to echo what Amanda has said. This is not a study about innovation per se. It's about the environment in which innovations are evaluated. And that's what's important. And that's why it's an important insight into the mentality of the public service. I can only wish that this study will be replicated maybe in 10 years. 5 years would be too early, but I hope that Étienne and Carey get together in 10 years' time and redo the study and allow us to use their findings this time as a baseline and to see how the public service is evolving. What are going to be the sources of inspiration? What are going to be the sources of confirmation that an innovation is going to be valuable and adaptable and applicable? My bet is that it's still going to be the private sector. The private sector is going to lead the way, something that you guys haven't really captured. It's still the private sector that shows the way on innovation. Maybe I'm being controversial here. And the task for public servants is to make sure that they keep open an important link, a very important link with the private sector to know where the future lies. It's not going to come out of government. It's going to come out of the private sector. And that's why that liaison is pivotal. I'll end on that word.
Great. Well, thank you again, Carey and Étienne, for your sharing your paper again today. And Patrice and Amanda for sharing your observations as well. You know, from the questions and the fact that the audience held so well for the entire hour, which is quite remarkable. Yeah, it just points to the fact that we could have a day-long symposium exploring different parts of this. It's an important topic, and it's already making me think of some follow-up opportunities, perhaps with IPAC or perhaps some partner organizations. So thank you to all of you. Thank you to the audience for coming in today. We wish we could have had more time to take more questions. The discussion would have been very rich. And then finally, I want to thank the Institute of Public Administration of Canada's national headquarters and Ashley and Aaron for setting up the webinar and navigating the innovative technology that we've come to rely on to do webinars. So with that, thank you very much. Have a good day, everyone.